One of the things that is odd about my background is that I went from law to being a software engineer. And I will tell you this, it is definitely not the most efficient way to become a software engineer, either in terms of time or tuition bills. But I am glad to have turned the corner, turned to software engineering. And one of the things that my resume hides is that it's always been a lifelong hobby of mine. I grew up building out gaming PCs, building websites on the early web, and I've always nerded out over technology and its impact on productivity and what we can do in the world. So
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing amazing conversations like the one we have for today. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor and an advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies, and as a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show, and of course, the added bonus, you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact, Peter Sayer writes at CIO.com about results from a survey of 965 global IT decision makers conducted in the past month by Foundry, the site's research division. The survey revealed that 1/3 of enterprises with an interest in doing more with AI have hired or are looking to hire a chief AI officer. 56% either have implemented generative AI solutions or plan to soon. The survey also revealed that 41% of those currently using generative AI are using it for software development. 67% of large enterprises have either hired or are actively seeking to hire data scientists, specifically to support generative AI. 45% of those hired to support generative AI are tasked with integrating data from different systems, while 45% are focused on security and privacy. Particularly relevant to today's conversation is that 48% of respondents say the primary motivation to invest in generative AI is to improve employee productivity. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. Now, shifting to this week's conversation. The future of work is all about using AI to be better at more things, producing high-quality output with the aid of machines, and improving productivity for individuals and teams. We've talked a lot about using AI to increase productivity for remote-first teams, with great guests like Jordan Husney from Parable, Darren Murph, formerly from GitLab, and most recently, Adam Nathan from Almanac. Today, we get to discuss the future of making time for what matters at work using AI. Imagine if your calendar was smart enough to know your priorities, when it's okay to interrupt you and your colleagues, and what you should be doing and when to be most productive. Matt Martin founded Clockwise in 2016 to fix the time problem. Since then, he and the team have raised $76 million from an exceptional group of investors, including Greylock, Cotu, Excel, Bain, and common investor, the Slack Fund. More than 15,000 organizations run Clockwise, give employees back millions of hours of focus time. Prior to Clockwise, Matt was an engineering leader at Relate IQ before it was acquired by Salesforce for $390 million in 2014. Matt holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth and a law degree from Penn. And without further ado, Matt, it really is my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you got into this space.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dan, and thanks for the stellar overview of where we're at with Clockwise and a little bit of my background. I have one clarification, which is that we've created over 5 million hours of focus time to date. So I'll make those millions into 5 million and counting. And happy to put that productive time back in so many high quality organizations' calendars. For me, yeah, that was a good high level overview. I mean, one of the things that is odd about my background is that I went from law to being a software engineer. And I will tell you this, it is definitely not the most efficient way to become a software engineer, either in terms of time or tuition bills. But I am glad to have turned the corner, turned to software engineering. And one of the things that my resume hides is that it's always been a lifelong hobby of mine. I grew up building out gaming PCs, building websites on the early web, and I've always nerded out over technology and its impact on productivity and what we can do in the world. So that is my life's journey and what has brought me to Clockwise.
So I mentioned before we rolled the tape that you and I are having a reunion after having met when Clockwise was just launching. And I remember at the time thinking about Clockwise as an extension for my calendar. Now, this many years later, when I look at Clockwise and I see it on your website described as a time orchestration platform, I'm like, this is nothing like a calendar. And this is, if you could start over and forget everything that we've learned about calendars, that's Clockwise. Like, how do you think about the vision and the 5 million hours and this being much more than a calendar plugin?
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective there because we have come a long way, but it feels like we still have so much space to run. The one-liner way of talking about Clockwise is that we are an AI-enabled calendar automation tool that coordinates the way individuals, teams, and companies prefer to work. And this helps take the pain out of scheduling and create time for what matters. And so, on one level, what we are is a way to augment the calendar. And we pride ourselves on having a simplistic, easy to adopt feature set. And so if you want to think about us as a calendar augmentation tool or an extension, we do not mind that at all. But to your point, what we're trying to do is help under the surface, help individuals, teams, and companies make the most of their most valuable resource. And my kind of key insight in finding the company, along with my two amazing co-founders, is we were all working in software engineering. As you mentioned, we were at Salesforce post-acquisition. And being somebody that has nerded out on this for a very long time, I was observing alongside with the two other co-founders just how difficult it seems to get the schedule you want in the day. And it looked like this is not a unique insight. I think anybody inside of a knowledge work organization can empathize with having a bad schedule and feeling like you're running around with a chicken with their head cut off. But what I slowly learned to appreciate is that while time feels very individualistic, we think about it as my time, my calendar, how do I improve my schedule? Inside modern organizations of any sufficient size, time really has become a shared asset. And when you translate something from an individual asset to a shared asset, like we've done with time over the past 20, 30 years in an accelerated fashion, certainly we've always collaborated with each other in the office space. 30 years ago, if I wanted to meet with you, I would call you up and see what works for you. Whereas now, if I'm working alongside you, I just look at your calendar and take the time. And when you translate any resource from an individual resource to a shared resource, you can often create a tragedy of the commons. And I think that's what we've done with time. Everybody's vying for it. Nobody's really managing it collectively. Nobody's regulating it. Nobody's putting boundaries around it. And so it ends up getting trampled. And so that's the longer formation of how I think about Clockwise and what we're seeking to power in the world is creating that platform that helps anything that interfaces with your time or priorities make sure that it works in the way that's best for you.
So I am as guilty as anyone of never having met a time management tool that I didn't like. And whether that's Calendly or there are a bunch of interesting improvements in Google Calendar, etc. And yet I still find myself bemoaning the fact that I think of time management like a game of Tetris, and there's some optimal way to make the different size blocks all fit together to achieve an outcome. And all of those tools, they're not really smart. Like they're just features that help you share your calendar or do various things. But the idea of a companion that can point out the flaws in my logic or make recommendations, like that to me seems like there's a gap. And like when I try to just understand like why after so many years, like time management's still broken, it seems like maybe I don't have a solution. That's my distillation of the problem statement. Like, how well does that map to your vision for Clockwise?
I think that's right. The one thing that I found over the years of focusing intensely in this space is that I also, Dan, love time management tools. Is partially why I'm in this business and started this company. And I think tools have a big role to play. At the end of the day, tools can help. They can help orchestrate, they can help coordinate. But really, so you think about what Clockwise does. We coordinate schedules across an organization in order to create more time for focus in your day. Everybody needs time for focus, whether you're an individual contributor, you need a lot of it, or whether you're a manager, or whether you're an executive and you need a few hours a week. Everybody needs it. And so we move schedules around automatically according to everybody's preferences to find the best times for those meetings and to create focus time. But at the end of the day, you've got to figure out how to use that focus time. And so I always stress, while I think tools have a critical role in untangling this ball of yarn we've created, at the end of the day, you've got to prioritize how to use your time once we give it back to you.
So one of the things I sometimes ponder is whether or not humans in our default state were meant to be scheduled the way we do at work. Is it a time management problem that we're trying to solve, or are we really just swimming upstream with respect to how humans are wired to do tasks?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, and one, honestly, that I've never been asked before. It's an interesting philosophical question, Dan. To some extent, I think it's asking, were humans designed to go 60 miles an hour driving a car? The answer is clearly no. I don't think we were engineered or that we evolved to be scheduled on 5-minute increments day in, day out. That's certainly not the case. So in the modern way of working and the demands that we have, that's a reality. So whether or not it's the case that we were evolved to function this way, we've proven that we can to some extent, in that we have to, given the demands of the workplace. Now, I think that the constraint on this, where I think people go awry, is we've had days, I'm sure everybody in your audience has had days where you're scheduled back to back to back. And there's no doubt, and the behavioral science backs this up, it's very draining on humans to go back to back in meetings all day, especially on Zoom, but in person as well. It saps you of your ability to focus, of your ability to make decisions, of your drive to continue work. Like it saps your resolve over time. And so I do think, to your point, while I would state that whether or not we've evolved this way, this is how we were asked to function, I think we need to push back on our schedule in key critical areas to allow for the time and space in the day to recharge and allow the time and space in the day to do deep thinking. There's a book that your audience may be familiar with by Cal Newport, a professor, called Deep Work. And while I think Professor Newport goes a little bit far in some directions, I agree completely with his core thesis, which is that deep work, deep thinking is one of the most valuable assets that anybody in a knowledge work function brings to their job. Everybody needs that time in order to add value to their job. And it's something that our modern way of working not only gets in the way of, but can actually be negatively impacting our cognition, because we're training ourselves to get these little hits throughout the day of dopamine. You go to the Slack message and you respond, you triage your email inbox and it feels productive. And deep work is it's a different character of work where you have to go heads down on a project and really think. And so I do think that a big part of what Clockwise adds to the world and what we should all think critically about is, how does my day need to be structured in order to enable me to do the best work? And I would observe that deep work is part of that mix.
I completely agree with that thesis. And I haven't heard about the book. I'm going to pick it up and read it. That concept of deep work makes so much sense. As insanely ambitious entrepreneurs, I feel like we associate value with how many meetings, how many people we've met, how many pitches we've made. And we devalue that, I love the term, the focus time. So I wonder if it's more a cultural issue or a philosophical issue that we need to address. And maybe, for as much as tools like Clockwise are a big part of the answer, it really is part of a bigger conversation about what's the best way to be productive relative to some set of objectives that you have. Does that fit into kind
I
of
think that's
your
absolutely
narrative?
right. That's absolutely right. So the thesis behind Clockwise is that without additional tooling around the shared space of time in an organization, without having something that's seeing all the schedules, preferences, and coordinating amongst them, that it becomes very difficult for an individual to get the schedule they want. But we're not going to dictate to you what you should want. Now, we nudge towards creating focus time. That's something that we can help you with because we think it's very critical philosophically. If you want to use Clockwise to get back to back meetings, our defaults advise against it. I would advise against it, but you can
Yeah.
get it. And so the tool helps enable what you seek, but it is ultimately a cultural question and an individual question about what is that schedule that you want? What is that schedule that enables you the best work? Again, the defaults in our product steer you towards having some mix of focus time, having breaks between meetings, setting aside time for lunch, putting down work when the workday ends. But it's a question that everybody has to ask themselves. And I think it's a question that increasingly organizations have to ask themselves and take responsibility for.
With the advent of Gen AI, our notions of the art of the possible have been expanded dramatically. And one of the things that I imagine you've been thinking about at Clockwise is that kind of wise friend that knows about your calendar and your priorities, et cetera, and can actually be pretty opinionated beyond maybe what you refer to as default. Okay, do you realize that 19 hours today is being scheduled? That's just a heuristic. But do you envision a time when Gen AI is a co-pilot for your calendar?
Yeah, absolutely. So to take you on a little bit of our journey at Clockwise, we had been monitoring generative AI for a while. Clockwise has had various components of intelligent systems in its pipeline basically since the start. One really simplistic example is we had a model that trained up as to whether something was travel time, a block on the calendar, because it's not always obvious that somebody has scheduled that, whether it's a hold, whether it's a personal hold or whether it's a work hold, these sort of things. And so we've always had elements of ML in our product, but we were observing generative AI as a new frontier back with GPT 2, 3, certainly with Chat, GPT 3.5. But GPT 4 was a real aha moment for us. We saw that come out, and the important element of GPT-4 for us was that it allows for reasoning about time. And I want to, this is obviously your audience, I think, is a very savvy one in this area. And so I'll be a little bit detailed in our observations, maybe a little bit more nerdy than I usually am on a podcast. The GPT-4 is still not great about, you might naively think you can dump it a bunch of calendar context and then ask it to reason about how to rearrange things. And unfortunately, it's not great at that, not only because it's a probabilistic machine and calendars, you do want a deterministic result. It's not great if you get something that just probably works. You really need to ensure that everybody's available and that it can be a correct result if you want to, at least if you want to make it into an application. And the other element is that it can get very easily confused about relative dates, especially when it starts to juggle a bunch of them. However, GPT-4 did get good at translating natural language into pretty accurate translation into time requests, or relative requests. And so what we saw is that we could possibly enable the vision that so many companies have had before us, whether it's Clara Labs, X.AI, myriad others, that it might just now be possible technologically to enable that full calendar assistant, that full calendar co-pilot. And we've been working and chipping away at that for the last about 4 months, and the results are pretty astounding. And I would say, obviously, your audience can take my prognostications here with a grain of salt, since it behooves me to say this, but the marrying of GPT-4, the world's best LLM, with Clockwise's scheduling engine that we've been building for the last 6-7 years, that really is the magical unlock, because now you can converse with something that can understand and reason about your intent and your requests. And then we can utilize that information to go and put them to a calendar through our scheduling engine. And it's pretty phenomenal. And so it's a very long way of answering your question, which is not only do I believe in that future of having that calendar co-pilot side by side with you, we are building it right now and very excited about the future.
So Matt, as entrepreneurs, the easy question to answer with regard to AI is always what could go right. And clearly, you and I share a common vision about all the things that could go right with a co-pilot for the calendar. But we also talk a lot about the ethics of AI and what it means to practice AI responsibly. And in this case, it's also important to have a discussion about what could go wrong. When that when that co-pilot is fed information about private events and activities that, maybe I don't want involved in recommendations, or my colleagues' calendars, maybe that I can see, but that the co-pilot shouldn't be aware of. I'd just throw those out as a few possible starting points for discussion. But what do you think about in terms of what could go wrong, and how do you build features that scale and that are intuitive, but also that respect things like privacy and confidentiality?
Yeah, there's just a tremendous amount that could go wrong, from the very basic stuff, like you asked the AI to schedule with Dan and it schedules with the wrong Dan, all the way down to really tremendously damaging stuff like you hinted at, which is leaking of private calendar information that's very sensitive. And so for us right now, we've taken a pretty hard-nosed approach. This doesn't solve for the future, which we think a lot about, but right now we really don't allow the AI to access broad-based calendar information directly. We always act as the arbiter between the request and the calendar information itself. And so when we use OpenAI's endpoints, they're actually not getting any underlying calendar information from us. What we're sending is the prompt and the request, and then OpenAI is helping us understand what's the intent of that request, and then we act on it. They got nerding out a little bit, made our own custom cell that allows for translation of kind of calendar requests into intent. Now, that said, the future vision here certainly does allow for training up on your individual calendar information so that we can gain preferences and priorities over time. And there, I think you have to take the underlying privacy structure of the calendar. So it's easy to forget because calendars are complex systems, but they actually do have a privacy system baked into them. And we take that as gospel. So is the event private? Is it shared? What are the organizational defaults? But having built this for 7 years, we're quite good at that. It's one of the complexity areas of calendar, especially when you're commingling calendar data. We do not leak that information. We consider it to be a P0 violation of the privacy layer. And knock on wood, we haven't had a leak of that nature in a very long time because we keep that information very segregated. I can envision a future around the corner where we're allowing for the training up on your personal view of the calendar. So what can you see as determined by those privacy rules in the calendar, but not allowing for broad-based customization on the organization's calendar, because then you have commingled private data. But one could envision for sure scenarios where it would be helpful to have information trained up from that organization's calendar. But I think that's good to be very cautious. And depending on which side of the coin you're on, if you're an innovator, it can feel overly conservative. But if you're the consumer, you have to be overly conservative here, for better or worse.
So here's a challenge that is not specific to Clockwise, but I still really want to get your perspective. It feels like a commons problem. We all benefit from more robust NLP, which comes from access to, let's say, bigger models or better trained or pre-trained models, but we don't want to contribute the training data to improve those intelligence. It feels like that's right, like in the crosshairs of the LLM economy. And just be curious to get your perspective on how do you find the right boundaries?
It's a very good question. I think that there's been a lot of conversation around whether AI and LLMs are a disruptive technology or enabling technology for some of the large platforms. And I think it's pretty clear that there's a huge advantage if you are already a silo of data. So if you already have access to underlying data, it's lower friction. Of course you should, and you're obliged to get the user's consent on training that data. But it's just way lower friction for those providers to be able to spin up customized models or to spin up customized information. And so I think a lot of us are going to end up being contributors to these data, to these models. Maybe not the big, huge public models like OpenAI or Anthropic or others or Google. And some of the applications of those really don't require customization at that level, but I do think the private clouds will enable customized data. There's no doubt in my mind that every Fortune 500 organization is going to have multiple custom models trained on their own private corpus of information. And I think that for better or worse, again, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, some of the existing cloud vendors are well suited to provide that private training. So I think, Dan, that a lot of us are going to be contributing data through our work environments as a corporate policy, not as a personal question. And that's agnostic of a view on that. I'm happy to talk about my own personal view on that, but I do think that's where the puck is going, so to speak.
I feel like, unlike many technologies, Clockwise truly at scale changes the fundamental way that we work. I'm not just saying that because you and I are recording a podcast about it and you're the CEO of the company. I really feel that way. Would love to know for the founder's eye view. Think big.
Yeah.
Like when Clockwise is ubiquitous, not just does Matt make a bunch of money or Matt's investors make a bunch of money, but like, how does work change?
Yeah, no, this is okay. So thank you for the opening because I would love to geek out on this one with you. So I there's something fascinating here. So with every kind of shift in the era of economy, and so here I'm talking about like long, big shifts, like the industrial age, the manufacturing age, the information age. There's usually been there. I'm no expert here, and there have been tons of books written, but my observation is that there's usually been a associated shift in working practice. And so you think about the assembly line, and again, not taking a judgment call view on whether the assembly line was good or bad for humans and the human worker, certainly pros and cons, but it enabled the machine age to really thrive in terms of productivity gain, in terms of the yield in the economy. And I think with information technology, we're actually to some degree stymied by the adherence to old styles of working and process. Humans just aren't meant to consume from the fire hose of information that we're currently asked to consume from. Setting aside meetings, just the deluge of information, whether it's email, Slack, comments. I'm switching my tab switcher here. I have 8 different applications here that have a badge on them. I don't have one inbox, I have dozens. And so I do think that Clockwise, really big brained long term vision, I think that we can help enable a style of work that accrues to the benefit of the human rather than requiring the human to skate to the technology. And I think that's what AI is really about at its best. There's a lot of talk about how AI could disrupt economies, that it could put a lot of people out of work. I think that there are huge, massive shifts in the economy that definitely will have winners and losers, and I don't want to undersell that. However, I think the real promise of it is augmenting humans so that they can work how humans best work, and the technology and software can take the brunt of what technology and software is best at. And I think we're living in the wrong mix of that right now.
I so believe that thesis, Matt, and I firmly believe that every job can be simplified with AI, even in the face of a bunch of cultural and societal pressures that make life and life work balance harder. Even if you are a blue collar worker, white collar worker, it doesn't matter. Any profession, there are just a lot more constraints on your time. And I've always felt like time is currency. And figuring out a way to optimize how we use that currency is, I would say, something as dramatic as the answer to the biggest question in life in terms of feeling fulfilled as humans. So I'm going to take the bait and say it's the right problem to be solving, and I think it will have dramatic impact if we get it right.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's certainly part of the journey that we're on. We focus right now today on making sure that you can get the best schedule that enables work. And if you squint at what we're doing, it really is a direct antecedent to that ultimate vision, because Clockwise largely helps in the background. We help automate and we help get things out of your way so that, again, you as a human can work the way that works for you. But as hinted at earlier in the conversation, even though we've been doing this for 6 years, 7 years, there's still so much to go after here. And I think that AI LMs have really accelerated the trajectory we're on, which is exciting.
Matt, unbelievably, we're almost out of time. I know we went way off script. Thank you for letting us do that. But I'm not letting you go without answering one last question for me.
Of
Think back
course.
to your days, whether it was a software engineer or prior versions of Matt, and fast forward to today being the CEO of a very successful, fast growing company. What's one thing that nobody teaches you in CEO school that turns out is pretty hard?
Oh man. I would say that, you know what, to some degree, I think this is something that people talk about a lot, but it's really difficult to understand until you're in the thick of it, which is just the personal psychology and how important that is to master your own personal psychology in terms of being able to be effective in your job. I think it's people say it so often that it's almost trite, but it is a lonely job at its core. You are trying to navigate all this ambiguity, all of this complexity while hopefully leading a very talented team forward. And it can be very easy to get lost in kind of thoughts of where are we going? Am I good enough? Am I good at this? How am I going to get over this next hill? And so that's been a surprising part of the journey for me. And I think if you can make it part of your journey and grapple with it, it's actually, at least for me, has been very rewarding and a fulfilling part of the job ultimately. But that's a component that I don't think people fully understand until they're in the seat.
Matt, I've really enjoyed this one, particularly the bits about the philosophy of humans and how we were meant to spend our time. I would love it if you come back sometime and we'll maybe continue that conversation.
Absolutely. Let's not make it 6 years this time, though.
You bet. All right, that one will be easy. Hey, Matt, where can the audience learn more about you and the great work that your team's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. The best way to go is just go to clockwise.ai. You'll find information about Clockwise writ large and specifically our new AI scheduling product. If you're just curious and following along for the journey, I'm actually most prolific on LinkedIn right now. You can search me on LinkedIn. I'm sure you'll find me. That's where I'm tending to post. I'm occasionally still on Twitter, X, whatever we want to call it today, and enjoy my little pocket of siloed information on Mastodon as well. But yeah, feel free to reach out anywhere you find me.
Brilliant. All right, Matt, we are all rooting for you and the team to succeed. Great work, and look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks so much, Dan.
You bet. Well, that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from People Rain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.